evolution of remittances in particular, but other areas of finance to the developing world. And I think we're all quite familiar with these charts because that's what we see from the World Bank puts out these very good updates every 6 months. But I think, one of the key things with remittances is you see, apart from the fact that it's been on a pretty continual upgrowth since 1990, is that it's not been shooting up in the same way as FDI, but in a much more reliable and predictable way, which is one of the key things about remittances. They're growing, but in a way that is quite predictable and reliable. And I guess we can have some discussions about whether that will continue. We hope it will. And I think one of the other points is, of course, that we know that remittances, these numbers are only the official estimates, and we've already heard a number of people say there's at least 50% more probably that's flowing informally, and I think we will discuss informal quite a lot over the next few days. So I think seeing the difference there between remittances and overseas development assistance, you can see that back in 1990 there wasn't a big gap between them, but you look at the gap now and it's widening all the time. I'm not sure whether all of you have had a chance to see the latest figures that Dilip Rata and his team put out last week, or 10 days ago, on what's going to happen to remittances over the next 2 or 3 years. The general view that they have is that there'll be a small growth, less than 1% this year, to $442 billion to developing countries. And then there'll be slow growth of about 3.5% a year, 3.7% a year heading up towards 2018. So pretty static. If you look at the bottom numbers, you probably get a better idea on some of the differences by region. Latin America and the Caribbean actually seems to be the main growth region, largely driven by the strength of the US economy. I suspect also there's an amount of Trumpism in the transactions going at the moment. People are sending them before the wall goes up. But I think there are actually some serious stories about people who are so frightened by what could happen with the US election that they are sending money now just because if Mr. Trump gets in, things might change. So, but I don't think that's what's behind that prediction. That's more just about, if you look last year, there was a 6.5% growth. So it's actually due to the strength of the US economy. And then you look at some other regions and you see that we're actually seeing a fall in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa and Europe and Central Asia for a variety of reasons. Part of it is postulated on the lower oil price, particularly, which is impacting the Gulf region, which of course is now one of the major drivers of remittances. But I think, part of it is clearly driven by some of the barriers or restrictions that are being put up by countries like Saudi Arabia, which are not attracting or not taking as many migrants as there were before. So I think you would say steady as she goes in terms of growth, or a bit slower than usual, but still a very large figure, which in total 628 billion by 2018 for formal, or 473.4 billion, according to these numbers, by 2018 to developing countries, or low and middle income countries now. Migration, I think we all know the numbers, or we've seen the numbers, 250 million international migrants approximately, which makes it, I think, the 5th largest country if it was a one single nation. So it's a phenomenal number of people, of which about 8% are refugees, which I think is obviously very topical at the moment, certainly in a lot of people's press coverage and so on, but it's a continual phenomenon. I think one of the points that often gets missed, but I think everybody here will know, that intra-regional migration is actually the most significant, but normally, certainly those of us who are based in Europe and the US think that everybody is coming to our countries, and that's a bad thing, which of course it isn't. And the south-south migration is much greater than the south-north migration. And then I think, again, all familiar with the New York Declaration on Refugees and Migrants, which listed a number of areas here, which I won't go into in the interest of time, but just covered some of the ways that the international finance institutions can contribute. So I just wanted to talk, so we're all on roughly the same page, about where we are at the moment. So some of the market characteristics we see, as we know, cash is still very much king. I know we're going to talk a lot about mobile, electronic, digital, and so on, which is great, but I think we shouldn't be looking at that as just something that can tweak what we have. It's going to have to be a fundamental shift. 95% is probably a conservative estimate as well. When you look at a company like Western Union, and they say 7% only of their transactions are coming through their digital channels, and they're the leading company in the world. You can see that most money is still going via cash. We know these are relatively low value transactions. Averages vary very much by corridor. The World Bank has consistently said that the average is around $500 and the Mo $200. I think what's interesting is when you look at the mobile space, the average transaction there, according to GSMA, is at $82. One can say it's not a right or wrong, it's just what's causing the difference in values could be of interest. It's a highly fragmented market. I think we talk about remittances as if it's one market. It's actually 200 and something countries by 200 and something countries of flows. And then if you look at the people who are operating, there are a lot of very small operators. You know, I mentioned Western Union, they have something like 17% of the formal flows. Next biggest one is probably UAE Exchange now, actually, at about 6%. But after that, MoneyGram, 4%, RIA, 3.5%. When you go down, you've got thousands of operators. That's how it works at the moment, and that's part of the challenge. Is it's not like one of these global industries where you have 3 or 4 big suppliers that you can work with. Competition is generally increasing, although we'll talk a little bit about why it's not increasing as much as it might have. I think governments have made some progress in removing exclusivity clauses in some countries, which has helped. And I think the market conditions have brought new players in. But generally speaking, we haven't seen as many new entrants as we might have expected, given the way technology is moving. And that's another thing we need to look at. And I think it's as I said, it's a multi-market business. By that I mean it's very different. You know, the corridor from South Africa to Zimbabwe is completely different to the corridor from, let's say, the UK to Nigeria. Different circumstances, different regulatory environments, different customers, different needs, different earning capabilities, all of those things. And I think that's one of the things when we're looking at solutions, that whilst we need to look at things that are going to work in multiple places, we have to understand that we need very tailored programs. You know, not to pick on anybody, but Ethiopia, so I am picking on someone, has a different set of requirements to a country like Sierra Leone, and we need to understand that and come up with what can we learn from other markets, but what do we need to tailor to suit our own environment. The challenges. I know we had a request from Mr. Koloko not to spend too much time on the challenges, but I think unless we understand and agree on those, we can't look at the opportunities. So forgive me for a minute anyway. I think generally there is weak or incomplete policy formation in many countries. I know that's being addressed, and that's part of really what this program is also about, which is great, but that's an environment. Sorry, that's to tell me I should stop now. We've got incomplete data. We've heard about that. Without better data, it's very difficult for policymakers to make decisions that they can justify, particularly if you've got to convince people who don't actually aren't fully engaged with this topic. So it's really important we find ways of getting better data. Markets are often inefficient. We know that from the high prices, the barriers to entry, the challenges for consumers, etc., etc. The informal market, for me, this is one of the biggest issues, particularly in ACP countries. And it's really, how do we find solutions, particularly where regulations in many of the sending countries basically enforce informal transactions. We call them informal as though people have a choice. But if you're not in a regulated migratory situation in a particular country, you're often not allowed to transfer money through any formal sector. So these people don't have a choice. So I think we have to sort of change our language a bit and also look at this a bit differently and look at, well, how can we develop solutions that will allow people who are currently excluded to be included, to be able to have a choice of how to send money. And that's one of the things I'd really like us to work on over the next couple of days. High transfer costs we've heard about, and poor access. We know that it is expensive to collect money in many regions. When we collect the price data for remittance prices worldwide on a quarterly basis, we don't take into account the financial cost of, or the opportunity cost of the time it takes somebody to collect the money, or the transport cost to go and get it. And I know that Mauro will probably tell us, because there was a study done on behalf of IFAD a couple of years ago that showed in I think 8 African countries the cost was at least $2 per transaction in opportunity cost and travel time. So if you added that, then the cost of 7.4% goes up probably another 0.5 to 1% again. So that's something else we have to address. How can we deal with that? An issue for the industry, and we've done well to have got 2.5 hours into today without talking about de-risking, so I thought I'd better put it in here. But we know that access to bank accounts for money transfer companies is a problem, but actually what's becoming more of a problem is access to bank accounts, correspondent bank accounts for many banks in developing countries. And that clearly is going to have a negative impact on the availability of services and potentially the costs as well. And then I think inconsistent regulatory approaches. Each country obviously needs to set regulations that are appropriate for its circumstances. The challenges are, if you're a money transfer company that's trying to drive economies of scale and operate in multiple countries, if you need to meet different regulatory requirements that require different reporting standards or different areas that require different training of consumers and so on, it's hard to drive the economies of growing a business whilst you're trying to meet multiple jurisdictional challenges. So anyway, those are the challenges. The good news is this model has to change. I think partially all of the people in here who have set and signed up to the SDG on the global pricing goal automatically creates pressures to try and drive the price down. We need it to go faster, but I think the environment is, pricing is an issue and we need to address it. Increasing competition, I said before, there's not as much as I would like to see. I sincerely believe that. I do think there are a lot of initiatives around some of the newer technology providers, but I think what we need to do is to find a means of encouraging innovation and encouraging people into the market whilst at the same time protecting consumers. Technology I've talked about, that is there. It's interesting that the largest digital money transfer company is also the largest traditional cash-based money transfer company. So for those people who have a sort of bashed at certain providers angle, you've also got to be careful that you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. But technology is coming. I know mobile, and we're in the birthplace of mobile money and cross-border payments. That's clearly could potentially be a real enabler, and I think we do need to spend some time looking at how can we really harness that for cross-border payments, which probably means starting on domestic payments first. De-risking I mentioned, and the regulatory side. I'm not going to do the summary because we can write that and show that on the last day once you've all done the work, because otherwise I'll give you all my answers, which I'm sure are not the answers you all have anyway. So I'm going to stop there.